Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sam Bruchhaus, and welcome back to the Class Play on the Sumer Sports Show. With free agency in full tilt, we're beginning to see how teams' offseason plans are playing out. Today, we'll go division by division, investigating the moves that teams have made and what they say about how they may approach the draft. Today, I again have $100 million guaranteed contributors with me, Ben Brown and Seth. Tage currently has a piece up on sumersports.com about how teams acquire players and how that affects the offseason. How's it going, Tage?
Great, Sam. Yeah, thanks for having me on. I think the contract that you gave me to come on here has a lot of void years in it. So, hopefully, we can spread out some of my guaranteed money, but it's nothing like Ben where you want him for the short and long term, I think.
Also joining us as always, Ben Brown. How you doing, Ben?
I'm doing well, guys. Yeah, I don't have any sort of guaranteed dollar stroke here, unfortunately. I don't know if I can agree with Taja's cap implications basically for this podcast, but I think we're building to maybe some sort of dynasty or something here coming up over the next couple of years. So it'll be good. But yeah, I'm just appreciative being here. Happy to be here, Coach.
Awesome. And so thank you guys. And to the members of the audience, as always, if you're listening, make sure to hit us with some comments. We'd love to answer any questions as we're going along, and feel free to participate, and we'll tag you in where we can. So let's start off with the NFC East, guys. Looking at Dallas obviously lost Dan Quinn to Washington, who we'll get into in a second. Seems like they're standing pretty pat where they stand. Obviously, they've been very successful in the draft. As a result, have a lot of big extensions coming up. Also, looking at New York is obviously looking to acquire a bunch of people, bounce back from last season. Very similar, lost a major name in free agency to an NFC East competitor. I like some of the things they've done with Drew Lock, bringing in kind of a swing backup quarterback that could probably fill in. Obviously, a big trade for Brian Burns. That'll be great, but they're kind of still in that rebuilding phase. I'm excited to see. But the big movers in the NFC East, Tage, obviously one was Philadelphia. How do you feel about Philadelphia?
So I liked most of the moves that Philadelphia made. Bryce Huff, I think, is a very efficient pass rusher. And I know that they're going to be asking him to take on more of a role than he had played in the past. But, I really trust the projections that the Eagles do. And I think that he should be able to fill in as an edge rusher role really well. Devontae Parker is a great wide receiver 3/4 type signing where you just want bodies at that position and don't want to have to put, someone like Zacchaeus or Julio Jones, like running the majority of routes. You want to spread those out so you can get juice at that position. Bringing back CJ Gardner-Johnson from Detroit to kind of replace him or to replace Kevin Byard. You get 4 years younger at the safety position. And, I think this is just opening up for the Eagles to look into more defensive backs, especially cornerback. And, if Howie Roseman breaks his precedent of going offensive defensive line in the first round, I think this might be the year where they actually do take a corner in the first, just to kind of shore up that back seven that they have there.
I know Philadelphia is looking to kind of bolster their pass rush, bring in some edge rushers. I know they're looking to move off of Hassan Reddick and a couple other people that have been rumored, of course. Zach Bond, I think, was a good bring in at a pretty cheap price. He was pretty productive down the stretch for the Saints last year. And then obviously Bryce Huff, another defensive pass rush specialist. It'll be interesting to see how those guys turn out. And obviously the Eagles have done very well with their player acquisition strategies. It'll be interesting to see how that goes moving forward. And now kind of the massive mover in the NFC East, Washington made a ton of moves, brought in a ton of big names. Ben, what were your thoughts on Washington?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fairly obvious, Washington is beefing up, obviously, interior offensive linemen, I would say in some ways like what they did with Austin Eckler and Marcus Mariota as well, I think probably signifies their approach, especially with what they're going to do at the top of the draft, number 2 overall. I think in some ways you have seen, I would say, the betting markets respond to what Washington did do in free agency. And I think it makes a lot more sense for them to kind of at least have honed in on Jaden Daniels at the number 2 overall selection. I do think in some ways, there's maybe still the possibility of them going up to 1 and getting Caleb Williams, but it very much seems like Drake May is kind of like the piece of the puzzle that no longer fits just based on this most recent kind of team building, I would say, kind of approach to what they did. So I think they're going to try and run the football, win defensively and in a ground and pound attack. And I do think that, a Jaden Daniels type player at quarterback makes a lot more sense than Drake May, I would say, in that sort of offense. So I think in some ways it indicates their hand for where they're going to go in the draft. And I think in a lot of ways, the betting market response to it makes a lot of sense from my perspective.
Yeah, I'm definitely on board. And it's clear that the new ownership obviously made if you're an NBA fan, that ownership group made a big investment in analytics at the 76ers. They made a big investment with the Commanders. And you see some of these names. There are a lot of names that analytics, Twitter and bloggers and stuff have brought up, like Frankie Louvu, Dorrance Armstrong, obviously close ties with Dallas as well, with Dan Quinn coming over. A lot of kind of poaching, one could say, or pulling from that well. But I'm very, very interested. The Washington's certainly put their name on a team to watch moving into the upcoming season. So moving from the NFC East to the AFC East, 2 more teams that kind of stood pat. Buffalo, obviously, building around Josh Allen. We saw them bring in Trubisky as a backup, kind of stand pat with, AJ Epinesa and kind of their D-line. I'm looking at them to kind of build on the margins. They have a pretty good team. They've competed for several years, buffering depth at DB, defensive tackle, wide receiver, obviously. I'm interested to see where they go there. Similar case for New England, but on the other side, I think New England stood pretty much pat. Their defense obviously has a lot of talent and has been built up. And with the new coach coming in, obviously they're still going to have that kind of defensive-minded Belichick style on that side of the ball. But it's been interesting to see how they're going to build up towards this number 3 pick. I mean, they brought in Jacoby Brissett, obviously a great backup quarterback, one of the better ones in the league. I think that's going to set them up very nicely to get a quarterback, whether that's May, Daniels, low chance that it's Williams, but anyone else at that kind of 3 slot. I think, I don't know if y'all agree with me, guys, but this pretty much sets them to take a quarterback with number 3. And I'm excited to see what they kind of do moving past that in the draft of how they focus on the offense. But I think that's going to be their main play. So looking at the other teams in the East, Miami, obviously in an interesting cap situation. Ben, what are your thoughts on how Miami approached the last couple of days and how they're going to move forward into the draft?
Yeah, I think it makes sense. Obviously, they are cutting in some ways salaries that aren't really, or trying to move on from salaries that aren't really reflective of the direction that they want to take the team. So, not making a huge priority of re-signing Christian Wilkins, releasing Xavier Howard, letting Andrew Van Ginkel walk, Robert Hunt as well. Like they, in some ways, what they brought in isn't going to make up for what they have lost. So I do think figuring out what they have in the draft, I do think Jordan Poyer is kind of an interesting piece, to their back end. Where they kind of end up from a secondary standpoint, I think makes a lot of sense. I don't know how I feel, I would say, in particular about the Jonnu Smith signing. I think if you are kind of allocating cap dollars to certain positions, that maybe wouldn't have been like the spot that I would have wanted to emphasize. But I don't know. I'm concerned about, I would say, a few teams in the AFC East, and I do think the Dolphins are kind of front and center to where they might not live up to kind of those like betting market expectations next season is kind of my initial read on the direction for where they've headed post free agency.
Yeah, and coming off of that prediction, looking at a team that had those high hopes and didn't necessarily live up to them last year, we have the New York Jets. Obviously, we're supposed to be having Rodgers coming back off an Achilles. Their defense was pretty darn good last year, and frankly, without that defense, I don't think they would have even had the record they had. Tej, what are your thoughts about what the Jets have done to kind of go into the next year with Rodgers, maybe a slight reset. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think Ben did a really good job of laying out like why Miami might have to take a step back next year just as the function of the players that they lost in free agency versus what they brought in. And I think the Jets are kind of at the opposite point of that, where they want everything to happen for them next year, in regards to being able to compete for the division, for the Super Bowl. And they kind of want to build a roster around that. And I think, it's really important to go out and get Tyrod Taylor and like have an actual backup quarterback this year. If Rodgers misses a game or two, he has a minor finger injury or something along those lines, like that's someone that can come in, and as long as they're healthy as well, like win that game for you if needed, like coming in at halftime. Like I didn't really think Zach Wilson was that type of quarterback. Javon Kinlaw, I thought was about on market, for some of the projections for him. And obviously losing Bryce Huff, you hope by spending as much draft capital as you have on edge rushers, you can kind of build that up with someone like Will McDonald next year. So, and I think it comes down to, are they going to sign Tyron Smith, to kind of shore up that other tackle spot? Pretty good trading with the Ravens today for their first tackle. Because then I think that opens up wide receiver or even tight end in the first round for them. If not, if they don't end up going through with that signing, I think that they will end up, drafting an offensive lineman in the first round. It just seems like the right thing to do. And, they're hoping that they can get their like Tristan Wirfs in the year that the Bucs won the Super Bowl, when Wirfs was a rookie, out of whatever rookie offensive tackle they end up taking.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I think we've done so much work the last couple of weeks on looking at the combine. And frankly, I've been pretty impressed with those kind of first round offensive linemen. Obviously, we don't want to let the combine kind of bias us too much, but it's a great time to kind of understand who's in the market and really do a deeper dive. And it'll be very interesting to see if they sign Tyron Smith, or if they go with a young offensive lineman in that Wirfs mold in Rodgers' last year or two. We'll see what they do, but obviously I think a little bit more focus on the offense for the Jets will be great. And we'll see what happens. And I think their cards are kind of all out on the table, and I think they gave us a really good sense of what they're gonna. We'll have a really good sense after free agency about what they plan to do. So moving down to the NFC South, we have New Orleans. New Orleans, obviously well known for their cap strategy. Not a ton of movement, bringing in Willie Gay, obviously a good backup to kind of their Pete Werner. Typically, they'll play two linebackers. Their best years, they've had three linebackers, notably in the last couple of years. Obviously, they have Nephi Sewell now. Used to have Quan Alexander. I think now that they have, Sewell, they have Pete Werner, they have Demario Davis, bringing in Willie Gay. I think they have a lot of options for what they can do kind of moving into the offseason with those four. Obviously, they lost Jameis, which we'll talk about when we get to Cleveland. As a Saints fan, that's a person I'm going to miss. Obviously, brought a lot of energy. But I think looking at the Saints in terms of what they may do for the draft doesn't really show us exactly what they will do. But I expect them to go looking at where they can fill in, where they can get young depth. Obviously, that's going to be their focus, given that some of those guys are getting up in age. I think they do have a lot of talent, but young depth is key for them. Similar spot for Tampa. Obviously, Tampa locked in with Baker, which I was really excited about. I kind of took my final victory lap on my Baker prediction that he was going to be a pretty good quarterback last year, and obviously paid off for him big time. Mike Evans obviously coming back. He'll have his top weapon. And they pretty much stood pat with signing, Levante David, Greg Gaines, Chase Edmonds. I think they're in a similar position, given to have an aging team with a lot of talent, young depth, interior offensive line, maybe edge rusher with Shaquille Barrett outgoing. I think they're in a similar spot as the Saints, and kind of soft launching this take. But I think the NFC South is going to be pretty good next year, though you may not recognize it because I think they may just split games with each other. And so moving into the two teams that we have seen a little movement from, Tej, let's hear about Carolina a little bit.
I love the NFC South is underrated take. I'm glad that, you've really seen this transition where you nailed your Baker evaluation last year. Now you're seeing some of these other teams, make some good moves. And like, I think Carolina is one of these moves. Like the Deontay Johnson trade is awesome. Like, I know that you gave up a starting level corner, but he's a separator. He's someone that ranks top 10, whatever separation metric you want to look at consistently. And I think that he's going to provide that for this Panthers offense. Robert Hunt, you could say it's a slight overpay, but like you want to bring in players like Robert Hunt, like Damian Lewis, where you just shore up those guard spots, you increase your floor in the run game, and then you also help Bryce Young navigate the pocket a little bit better. They've really sacrificed some of their defensive pieces to build up their offense, and I think that's the right move because next year is all about developing a young quarterback, and that's why I'm thinking that the Panthers will end up going and spending either picks 33 and 39 on wide receivers and, maybe another offensive lineman, or they spend 33, on a wide receiver. 39 is some type of defense just so they can build up, some of the defensive line, but so many options in the spot that they're picking at wide receiver. AD Mitchell, Keon Coleman, Xavier Worthy, Ladd McConkey, like one of those guys will be there. And I think that the Panthers can put out a pretty decent supporting cast for their offense this upcoming season.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head there. In terms of this wide receiver class, obviously a lot of hype about this wide receiver class. I think the deeper they go, I think given that they have a high second round pick, I think that'll basically end up being like, quote, a late first round pick for them, where they may be able to grab a top wide receiver talent. And then it'll also be interesting to see with a lot of people outgoing in terms of defense, what they do there. But looking at Atlanta, Ben, obviously you're a big Minnesota fan. Kirk Cousins going to Atlanta, leaving Minnesota. What are your thoughts on their kind of plan as a whole and what you think they're going to do in the draft? I think we're having a little technical difficulty. Ben, we can't hear you. Can you snap back on?
Snap back on. Kirk just sometimes puts me on tilt, and I just mute myself because I'm going to go crazy and went off. But yeah, I mean, I think, going to the actual discussion with Kirk Cousins, like, to me, it is in some ways difficult to, really put a quality team around a Kirk Cousins type contract. In a lot of ways, that's why we're seeing, I would say NFL teams kind of go in the opposite direction where they're prioritizing top end quarterback play at the top of the draft and trying to figure out the rest later. The Falcons, previously haven't really gone in that direction, with valuing Kyle Pitts and Bijan Robinson. And in some ways, the new regime is maybe buying into that a little bit to the point where they think they can put, I would say, a young nucleus around Kirk Cousins where they could be really good. But I think it does set them up, kind of like you guys said, to make the NFC South really competitive. To me, the Falcons do look like legitimate playoff contenders. In the NFC, the question obviously is like, can they get to the Super Bowl? And I think in some ways that's going to dictate, what they do or what they prioritize in the draft. It does seem like, going the Kirk Cousins route and the fact that we're trending in the direction where there's going to be 4 quarterbacks, maybe in the first 4 picks, but if not, above pick 8 for Atlanta, like that sets up really well for them to get, one of, the 3 wide receivers, or really their choice at edge and Dallas Turner or, Gerard Verse, or, their choice at offensive tackle if they kind of want to at least provide some depth to Jake Matthews as he, transitions into like the twilight of his career. But I think overall, like, it would be really intriguing if they added one of these 3, wide receivers, whether it's Rome Oduzne, or Malik Neighbors drops a little bit. I do think there should be an expectation that one of these 3 receivers does slide. And if they do, I think the Falcons could be talked about or written about as like one of the most exciting or hyped up offenses this offseason if they kind of go in that direction in the draft. And I think that is probably the best long-term scenario, from a roster building standpoint. 2 years. It's 2 long years, though. That's why they got no offense right away is like the thing, right? So,
yeah, and I think, interestingly, signing Kirk, I think, gives them the from a kind of scouting talent evaluation of self-scouting, gives them a ton of options for what they can do, because realistically they should know what guys they have and whether they're guys that should be considered extended, whether traded, things like that. Like, we'll, in theory, know the value of those players given what we know about Kirk Cousins. Obviously, we've seen him be very successful with young guys like TJ Hawkinson, Justin Jefferson, so forth and so on. In terms of that offense, we should know if we should finally know if Kyle Pitts is an impact player. Obviously, it seems like Drake London is an impact player. They bought low on someone like Darnell Mooney, who I played with. I think he's a really good player. He wasn't used probably as much as I think the Falcons probably value him at. They probably see him as an undervalued player. Bringing him in, I think you'll get to know very quickly if he's an impact player. And then obviously wherever they go in the first round, whether that's offense or defense, I think they have a real need at edge. But we'll see what happens. And within a year or two, we'll know if Atlanta's a team to beat or not. And obviously they'll be able to make decisions based off that. A lot of it, I think, was hindered by the quarterback position in the past, where they didn't really know what they had. And I think that problem has now been solved. So moving on to the AFC South, Indianapolis obviously was in a position last year where the quarterback was out for most of the year. They let Gardner Minshew, who was there probably going into this year, would have been their backup. They let him walk. Re-signed Grover Stewart. I think they have a pretty good young team, and we'll see what they end up doing in the draft. I'd expect them to go edge at least somewhere in with their top few picks. Tennessee, obviously, on another end from an ascending team. Tennessee's been, scrapping it out to try to compete the last couple years. We let them see big names like Derrick Henry, Danico Autry walk. I think they have a lot of places where they could go in the draft. I don't know. This is one of the teams where I think their moves made it a lot murkier on what their draft strategy will be. But I'm pretty certain that front office, given their commitment to analytics and kind of bringing in some new guys, I'm sure they have a path forward. It's just not evident by what they did in free agency. And I think that's probably because they have a younger team and are coming off a several years of really trying to compete and not getting all the way there. But looking at Jacksonville, Tage, what were your thoughts on some of the things that they've done?
Yeah, so putting together some of the pieces with what Jacksonville has done in free agency, I think the Gabe Davis signing 3 years, $39 million is interesting because you want to kind of see how a true deep threat, someone who can play vertically with a strong vertical route tree, looks in that offense where Christian Kirk and Evan Ingram, who I think are both really good at what they do, can work underneath. Based on that, when I've chosen Gabe Davis as my first option for that, I probably would have leaned like someone like MVS, but I can kind of see the vision that they're putting together in the receiver room. And then obviously continuing with that, Ridley is kind of, still, I think, deciding, whether he wants to go back to Jacksonville or take another team's offer if it's available to him or even more money. So, we'll see how that all looks. If Ridley comes back, I think that's like a heck of a pass catcher group. I assume Zay Jones would catch a stray, from that, but that's a really good group to build around. They tried to kind of like shore up their offensive line, getting Mitch Morse, and then, tried to also get a little bit more help in the secondary with Darnell Savage and Ronald Darby, but I don't think they'll be truly set at secondary until after the draft. I think that cornerback should and probably will be the move for them in the first round. And I think if Ridley does not sign with them, you start to think a little bit more about pass catcher being an option, but, probably not something at the top of their list with some of the other holes they have, in the secondary and even the offensive line.
Yeah, definitely. I think they're kind of in a flip of what Atlanta is in, where they think they have a franchise quarterback, a young franchise quarterback. They're really investing in wide receivers. It'll be interesting to see what ends up happening with Calvin Ridley. But I think that Trevor Lawrence should have a plethora of weapons, and we'll see if he can get it done. Moving on to another team with a young quarterback, Houston obviously overachieved what many expect last year. Ben, what are your thoughts? Obviously, they made kind of a lot of incoming moves. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, obviously really exciting. There are, I think, we always talk about like championship windows and those sorts of things and when should teams press their edge. But I do think if you have a rookie quarterback that has shown that he can be as good as CJ Stroud in his rookie year, like this is kind of how you go all in around him, right? And I think in some ways, they're pretty strong at receiver. Maybe they need a little bit of depth at that position, but overall have some top end guys as well. So going out and getting, Danielle Hunter makes a lot of sense, especially if he fits within D'Amico Ryan's like overall vision for how they want to construct a defense. Like they are in some ways building up at key positions and have the luxury to do so. And then in some ways are, taking shots on guys like Jeff Okudah, who I know, Tej thinks, probably isn't going to pan out whatsoever and probably rightfully so. But I think in some ways just adding like depth at, these weak tail type positions does make a lot of sense. To a similar thing with Michael Ford. So I like what they did along the edge. I do think they added a ton of pressure type numbers to their defensive line through free agency. And I think like, their position to, not only really challenge for the AFC South this year, but I think kind of make a name for themselves in the AFC at large and could be that team that is kind of in contention with the Kansas City Chiefs to potentially get to the Super Bowl in the next couple seasons.
Yeah, looking at their moves, my initial thought is all things considered, and if all things go well, that defensive line is scary. I mean, you're having Danielle Hunter, who's been immensely successful when healthy, Will Anderson, who was an absolute beast last year, Danico Autry, who I believe led the Titans in sacks last year. Obviously, he's a little older, but you have those three guys in a D'Amico Ryans-led defense. And that's really bolstering that defensive side of the ball in support of a young quarterback who, maybe the league catches up to him in a certain way. The tape's out on him. Obviously, there's a lot of adjustments with the new staff and quarterback last year that teams may have not had the tape. I wouldn't expect that, but it'll be really interesting to see, as was just brought up, how they approach a little harder schedule, coming off of a playoff run, some guys coming back, but in the draft, it'll be really interesting to see where they go. Kind of now that they're a marked man, or a made man. There's someone who's made the playoffs with a quarterback that people are really big on. Moving on to the NFC West, obviously we're looking at teams like Arizona, Los Angeles, Seattle, San Francisco. Tej is feeling good about where Arizona's at. He floated some takes to me that he thinks Arizona may be a sleeper going into next season. Tej, tell us a little bit about the NFC West.
Well, I mean, yeah, the reason why I think Arizona is going to be a sleeper going into next year is they have so much draft capital to work with. Like I loved what Monty Ossenfort was able to do in last year's draft, where, I think he came in, he understood that, they only had half of an offseason to prepare for the draft. So, he traded for some future picks. And, we were talking about this a little bit before the show. Like we think that teams discount future picks more than they should. And now he has the most draft capital in the entire NFL. Whether you use the Fitzgerald Spielberger chart or another chart headed into the actual draft here. And I still think on top of that, a trade with the Vikings or another team that wants to come up to 4 and take the 4th quarterback in this draft would be mutually beneficial for both teams. So if that's the Vikings coming up, the Cardinals going back and they're picking up, a combination of future picks and current picks in this draft and really just building up their draft capital. I think that, even though Marvin Harrison is a top wide receiver prospect, they can still get like a Roma Dunze, a Malik Neighbors, a Brian Thomas Jr. and have other spots filled. And I think that's kind of what they're setting up for with this free agency. Like Justin Jones, Sean Murphy Bunting, Bilal Nichols, like they don't move the needle a ton. They're good pieces that you can expect like decent level starting play from. But I really think that they're going to go in the draft and just use all the draft picks and all the draft capital that they have to really get a lot of these rookies in place and be ready for the second half of next year and then 2025 after that.
Yeah, and then looking at a team like LA, obviously, this has historically been a very competitive, or at least in recent history, been a very competitive division. LA brings in Jonah Jackson from your Lions, Tej. What are your thoughts kind of on where they may go from there?
Yeah. I mean, I think like, to bring in Jonah Jackson, to, re-sign Kevin Dotson, you're really just building this interior offensive line that is going to be one of the heavier and more powerful run blocking units. Like I think they're just going to run duo and just run the heck out of it next year. Which I know you'll like to watch, Sam. And I think like the other goal is to keep Stafford healthy, and they know that they can really compete with most teams in the NFC as long as Stafford, Kyron Williams, and Puka Nacua are all on the field. And so I think like when they go into the draft, they had so much young production on defense last year. They do have that first round pick this year that they haven't had since I believe 2016, 2017. So I think they're going to use that on edge or defensive back and just really work to make that defense an average level unit. And then they're going to hope their stars can carry them on offense.
Yeah, that checks out. And looking at, one of their competitors, obviously there's the McVay-Shanahan rivalry. Looking at San Francisco, obviously they've reshuffled their D-line a little bit. So kind of that kind of building up of the offensive line for the Rams, obviously that may be a little yin and yang there. Ben, what are your thoughts on San Francisco?
Yeah, I mean, they're kind of in an interesting, spot, obviously, like you said. Bringing in Leonard Floyd, the marquee signing for them, I think, is like noteworthy. Kind of like you said, they lost Javon Kinlaw, lost some depth along the defensive line as well. Brought in, I would say, more depth than what they lost previously, and I think in some ways prioritized defensively what they need to get right. To me, I think longer term, there's still probably questions about. Like where does the whole situation with Brandon Ayuk get resolved? Debo Samuel as well, kind of in a similar boat. Their offense has so many questions that I think, prioritizing the defense, although it makes sense, makes it seem more like they're all in this year, and then going to kind of need to hit the reset button next year, the year after, just based on, overall team makeup and where they're kind of heading from, a salary perspective and, some guys, with like Trent Williams and everyone else potentially leaving or accruing, like they're going to have a lot of movement offensively in the coming years. So I think this is kind of their signal that we're going all in one more time this year. Let's see where it lands. And then really going to have to figure things out next year with some hard cap decisions, I would say.
Interesting. And then finally looking at the final team in the West, Seattle, obviously they've stood pretty pat. I'd say that at least to me, I haven't really gotten a sense of what they may do in the draft. Tage, what are your thoughts on what they may do in the draft?
So I really think that the first round for Seattle is going to be about, getting some pieces in the front seven. I think they've approached this free agency period the right way, shaving a lot of the players that weren't going to really help them in 2025, which is, I think, what they're building for. You think about cutting both of the safeties, not bringing back Jordan Brooks, not bringing back Bobby Wagner. Like, I think that the back seven is going to be something that they can kind of build over time. Obviously, you have your two cornerstones in Witherspoon and Woolen there. So I think that they're going to look towards defensive line in the draft and try to really supplement that area with how they re-signed Leonard Williams, and then also build on their tight end core after that, once they move on from there.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then moving on to the AFC West, obviously we start looking at Kansas City, the champs. Obviously, like, you look at the people that they have incoming and outgoing, there's not a ton of change there. But obviously the outgoing names are some names that were relevant in the Super Bowl. Nick Allegretti, you look at Willie Gay, obviously Tommy Townsend, who could have been the MVP of the Super Bowl with that muff punt. Got to get quality, consistent punts and good things will happen. My corollary for them kind of is similar to how the Golden State or the San Antonio Spurs dynasty moved along, where, guys are coming in and out, but you look over and over again as the season starts and you're like, well, they didn't really lose anybody. And I expect them to actually add some pretty good pieces in the draft, whether that's, adding depth on that strong defense, particularly the interior defensive line. Obviously brought Chris Jones back, which was huge. It'll be interesting to see what they do with L'Jarius Sneed. Trade rumors obviously galore there, given he's such a valuable asset and performed so well last year. Obviously that might open up a need at cornerback. And then also everyone wants more weapons from Mahomes. I think that this deep wide receiver, even going into the second, third, fourth rounds, obviously they can make an investment there. But it really seems kind of like One year for the Golden State Warriors, Jordan Poole is good out of nowhere, and then this year they have two more people that they had drafted this year, years prior, that are all of a sudden good. And I'd be really excited to see who that person is for the Chiefs, because it seems like they do it over and over again. Moving on to another big name, outgoing. Denver obviously paying a huge cost for letting Russell Wilson go. Ben, what are your thoughts on Denver?
Yeah, I mean, this was, in some ways the discussion of free agency, whether it was worth it or not, right? And very much, cutting quickly, ripping off the band-aid in a lot of scenarios. Like it's tough to see, the current state of the Denver Broncos roster and be at all bullish about their intermediate or any sort of outlook, right? Because I feel like in every sense of the word, they're kind of stuck in a really poor spot. Obviously, still paying Russell Wilson, out from under him, traded Jerry Jeudy, who was going to be an unrestricted free agent next year. But they just don't have a ton of talent on this roster, I would say, in a lot of key spots, right? Like I think like Alex Singleton's probably their best player, middle linebacker, basically. Like they just don't have a ton of guys that really move the needle. And unfortunately, like with their draft position at 12th overall, they kind of sandwich between teams that are probably going to go quarterback. So unless they, move up, which they don't have the second round pick either, like they're not really going to have a quarterback this year. They're not going to go up and get their guy. So they're looking at defense, solidifying a defense that was, really poor by all intents and purposes. I think the, concerning thing is like Patrick Surtain, like he took a step back overall from a coverage perspective. They're one of the worst teams in football. So maybe they go cornerback, but to me, they're in a tough spot from the draft if they do want to focus on the needs that they have on this roster and actually getting a blue chip talent in one of the key positions. They're just not set up to do that whatsoever. And I think then, it's maybe an edge rusher falls, maybe it's a cornerback, but this is still a multi-year rebuild that is, still feels multiple years away.
Yeah, I think there's two major points that you hit on there. Obviously the multi-year rebuild. I think Sean Payton, obviously a huge long contract. I think he kind of has the ability to put his fingerprints all over. And what really kind of interested me about kind of their approach both to last year and this year, obviously last year, after, giving up 70 points to the Dolphins, everyone thought that this was, the process, the tank year. And it didn't end up going that way. They ended up scratching their way into games. I think Sean Payton really likes to win. And so it'll be interesting to see if as Beat Gamer 99 said, they're just looking forward to 2025, or if they shake it up or figure out a way to get in that top three. I know there's been some small rumblings about how much Sean Payton loves Caleb Williams. I don't know if that's exactly possible, but I almost wonder if they value that second tier of quarterbacks kind of more than the league consensus is. And I think that's what's really interesting when you look at a guy like, Michael Penix, who avoids sacks at a rate that is really incredible at the college level. That usually translates. Obviously, Sean Payton had Drew Brees, one of the best sack avoidant quarterbacks, especially late in his career, where he, kind of changed his whole game to avoid sacks, avoid negative plays. I wonder if they don't view a Bo Nix or a Michael Penix or someone in that vein as extremely valuable as compared to the rest of the league, and think they may be able to buy low for a big payoff. Moving forward into Vegas, Tage, what are your thoughts about what Vegas has done?
I cannot wait to watch Christian Wilkins and Max Crosby on the same defensive line. I think that run defense is going to be one of the best things that we've seen. But does run defense, necessarily correlate strongly with wins? Like that's a different conversation. I think that from a pure football perspective, it's going to be fun to watch. I think that they did the right thing in letting Josh Jacobs walk as well, especially for the contract that he ended up getting. And I think that like we just talked about with Denver, Vegas is another one of those teams where they want to be looking towards 2025. You start looking towards offensive line. You gave Gardner Minshew the contract to be your starting quarterback. Maybe you dip into the tier 2 of the Rattler, Penix, Nix kind of grouping in this draft as well. And might not necessarily want to take one of the top 4 quarterbacks, and then corner, I think, is also on the table for them. So like they're more of a blank canvas also. And, I think that them and Denver are kind of stylistically very similar entering this year, where like there's obviously no shame in tanking, quote unquote, for a year, where you can kind of like reset some of your cap health, reset some of your draft capital, and really focus on making a push in the next upcoming seasons.
Yeah, and if nothing else, I love the Wilkins move as well, because I can just imagine some great battles, even though the Chiefs may get the better of them, some great trash talking battles between Wilkins, Crosby, and Patrick Mahomes. I can't wait to see how that plays out. Moving into the final team, which obviously has had a full administration change, moving from Brandon Staley, who at the end of the year almost seemed kind of like a lame duck coach, to a just completely different mindset with Jim Harbaugh coming off of an NCAA national title. He loves the heavy packages. He loves big guys on defense. Ben, what are your thoughts about how Los Angeles is going to completely change and build around Justin Herbert?
Yeah, I mean, obviously their cap situation is difficult, right? And they do have a lot of dollars allocated to defensive guys that, for all intents and purposes, haven't really lived up to the hype. I haven't seen, Khalil Mack's like updated deal numbers for what he's going to be from a cap perspective this year, even like what his restructured contract looks like. They did cut Mike Williams today. So like they're still trying to find ways to really navigate what has kind of been set up before them. So I don't know. I don't love, I would say, the Will Dissly signing that they had. I know in some ways they have to figure something out with Gerald Everett, moving to Chicago, but I just think there was maybe a higher priority of going in other directions. But I do think, Gilman specifically, I think can be a key contributor to their secondary. So I like that move. Obviously they're set up really well with, top 5 draft pick, kind of maybe going to be, that one, the team that kind of has their pick of the non-quarterback, which I also think makes that a really valuable pick, in other teams' eyes. Or if, the quarterback, the Cardinals stand pat and take like a Marvin Harrison Jr., that means like that fourth guy, the Chargers are basically going to be kind of, I would say, in the driver's seat from the draft perspective. And I think that it sets up really well and could be a really strong indication to how they're going to approach, this Justin Herbert type window that they have. But I think, obviously they still have, some high end, defensive dollars doled out that are just going to be really difficult to overcome. But I think if they can find, a young playmaker in the draft to kind of pair with the veteran presence that they still have in Keenan Allen and really kind of nurse Justin Herbert along, like they at least have outs of being not only a playoff team, but a team that's possible, capable of potentially pulling off an upset still, on the road come playoff time. So although it's, going to be difficult to really see that play out, I do think, longer term, there is still an indication where they could at least be relevant in the AFC West discussion, I would say.
Yeah, I agree. And so now we move into kind of our final subset of divisions, the NFC and AFC North. Obviously, I think these are two of the better divisions, if not two of the more interesting divisions as well. And obviously, Tej and Ben, y'all are both big fans, grew up watching the NFC North. We're gonna start with Green Bay. Obviously, a team that, if not overachieved, achieved up to what was expected of Jordan Love. And then obviously there was some great upside with all that other young talent on the offensive side of the ball. Tej, what are your thoughts about where Green Bay's at, a couple days into free agency, and what that shows about what they may do for the draft?
Yeah, I mean, first off, making a Lions and Vikings fan talk about the Packers first is pretty criminal, Sam. But I can talk about it, and I think that the Green Bay Packers are like Leonardo DiCaprio, right? Like they just want to be young at every spot that they can be young at, and like that's why you make the move of paying for Josh Jacobs at age 26, moving on from Aaron Jones, who had some durability and age concerns. Like, again, like the contract was a little rich to me, but like I can see why they did it. I could see why they wanted to get younger and more durable at running back. Same thing at safety, right? Like you let Darnell Savage walk, you bring in Xavier McKinney, you pay top dollar for him, and you kind of have that type of player available to you. I think that when you look at, what this could mean for the rest of their offseason and going to the draft, their new defensive coordinator, Jeff Hafley, has preached on the importance of having safeties who can cover sideline to sideline. I was talking to my friend Avi about this today. Like, I think that he wants to see the secondary have an overhaul. So I can still see corner or safety on the table. And then because of the Bakhtiari situation, and, depending on what ends up happening with Elton Jenkins, I think that, and, they're losing John Runyon as well. Like, I think offensive line will also be a main focus in their draft also.
And then moving obviously to the team with the number 1 pick, kind of been in the bottom of the NFC North for the past year or so. Chicago obviously has the number 1 pick. With my take on it is that I frankly, I'm no longer sure what they will. I came into the week thinking they were 100% on Caleb Williams, selecting him, and now I'm not exactly sure given where the cards have fallen. Ben, what are your thoughts?
That is a good question. I'm still pretty adamant that they're going Caleb Williams. To me, what they end up doing with Justin Fields is kind of like the pertinent question, and what the offers have been. Obviously people talk about, the market drying up for him in a certain way. I do think it's probably relatively easy to see like the starting quarterback picture take shape after a couple pieces kind of fall. And I do still think there maybe are some players for the Justin Fields, depending on what the compensation is. I don't mind, them hanging on to him and going Caleb Williams. It's still kind of like figuring it out, because I do have, like you guys said, a ton of draft capital, are going to have like a really valuable selection at the number 9th overall pick if there is the run on quarterbacks. Again, kind of going back to it with Atlanta, like they're going to be in prime spot to potentially, solidify like the left tackle position, really well. They could go edge defender as well at that spot. And they do have Montez Sweat after like the in-season trade as well. So I think that they're just kind of like, they're an interesting team. I don't want to say the rebuild is completely over. Obviously having the number 1 overall pick indicates that. Moving back, like sliding back and getting a huge, bounty for that number 1 overall pick just isn't in the cards. Based on the direction from what I've seen, like I do think it's either Caleb Williams or they trade out of that pick. I just think that that's still a strong indication. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts, Sam, on kind of what changed from last week to this week to maybe lead you to believe that, they're going a different direction than Caleb Williams. Are you saying that they want to go a different quarterback, or would they be moving on from the pick in that scenario?
Well, yeah, it's just very interesting. We've seen so much smoke around Justin Fields to Atlanta, or Justin Fields to this team that needs a starter. And you just look at like where the leverage sits per se. And obviously if they have a quarterback on the roster who has, led them to a 7-10 or just under 500 record as he has, does that increase leverage for, another team jumping up and trying to take that pick, or does that increase demand of the pick? Does it obviously now that teams have kind of settled on their quarterback figure, you would think that their leverage is decreasing by the day, by each day that they don't trade Justin Fields, if they have already made the decision that they're going with number 1. I just think obviously time in any negotiation is a huge deal. And the fact that they didn't trade Justin Fields obviously makes me believe that they think they have some other leverage by keeping him on the roster. And the only way that really makes sense is if they're looking to trade out of that number 1 pick. Obviously they've traded back before. They may do it again. It'll be very interesting. I don't know. This is another team where I felt like I knew what direction they were going, and people could make projections off of that. And I feel like it's gotten a little bit murkier now, and it'll be interesting to see what happens in the next 2 weeks. And so now we're going to turn it to, Minnesota, Detroit, the Tage, Seth, and Ben Brown kind of strongholds, perhaps 2 of the most knowledgeable people on those 2 teams. Ben, tell us about Minnesota.
Yeah, I would not say that to Vikings Twitter, unfortunately. I know they look at the pitchforks out on you for that, basically. But no, I mean, it's interesting, right? Obviously, Kirk Cousins is going to dominate the headlines and the discussion. To me, it was weird because I feel like I became more pro Kirk the longer it went on. And like at like the final point, it was like, man, I wish they would just run it back for one more season and kind of see where it's at. Cause I don't really see like this, competitive rebuild or anything going all that well. Now they have nothing at quarterback. It would have been really difficult to obviously sign Kirk, and he would have had to, want to have some sort of indication that he really wanted to stay in Minnesota for another year, and it very much didn't seem like that was the case either. But I think I liked, the moves outside of that. Obviously getting younger, at the edge position, basically, I think in a lot of ways is going to help Brian Flores' defensive scheme quite a bit. I like both, I like the, kind of like the re-swap of the Texans players basically for Danielle Hunter in a lot of ways, I think is interesting. Andrew Van Ginkel, moving closer to home, getting, I would say, maybe a little bit of a team-friendly deal from that perspective, I think definitely helps them. My question is very much like, how do they approach this draft now? And do they need to give up a decent amount of draft capital in order to get up and actually draft one of these top-end quarterbacks? And to me, it very much feels like not only are they wanting to do that, but they need to do that. I think, Kwesi giving out multiple year picks to move up in this draft could be a tough sell, but I think is one that probably needs to happen at this point in time. I do think, just with the direction where the roster is going to go, pending, Justin Jefferson extension, like they kind of have to do everything in their power to show that they want to win now. And I think, moving up and getting a quarterback is kind of the one way of actually playing it. And that's kind of my expectation, unless we do see some sort of drop off, of those guys not necessarily going within the first 4 selections like everyone kind of projects right now.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think that they may have an edge similar to Denver. Like maybe they value one of those kind of second tier guys. Maybe they have something they like about those guys. I think that the approach that they've had is very interesting as well. Moving on to Detroit, Tage, what are your thoughts about what your favorite team has done this offseason thus far?
I mean, I have a lot of thoughts. I think I could turn it into like another hour of us going on here. So I'll try to keep this short. I think the Lions are trying to just take multiple dart throws at cornerback. So, they trade for Carlton Davis. They sign Amik Robertson from the Raiders. They already have Cam Sutton and Emmanuel Mosley, who they signed as free agents last year. And then I assume that they'll draft someone on day 2 as a corner. So you have 5 corners. You just hope 1 or 2 of them can be starting level, because you didn't really get to that level last year. I was fine with letting Jonah Jackson walk for the contract he ended up getting. I think the Lions are in play for DJ Reader. If they do end up signing DJ Reader, they will probably go offensive line or edge in the first round. If they don't end up signing him, I think defensive tackle would also be in play. And, I think that they're fine making a bet on the low value or the, kind of the low risk, possibly high reward corners that they have. And then they'll try to fill in, some of the offensive guard spots that they're now missing with Jonah Jackson gone and Graham Glasgow getting up there in age, as well as some secondary pass rushing next to Ali McNeil and Aiden Hutchinson.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. And I think that they showed how strong they were on offense this year. It'll be interesting to see how they move with the defense. And obviously they've been pretty exciting to watch in terms of they draft people. A lot of the analyst community says they've drafted people out of order. They draft not premium positions high, and then somehow it's all worked out for them. So it'll be interesting to see how they continue that success in the next year. Moving finally into the AFC North, which I think has 4 teams that in recent history have been very good. And I think 4 teams that are all in various stages of flux and all could be incredible next year, or we could see a regression next year. Starting out with Cincinnati, obviously adding Geno Stone from Baltimore, an interesting kind of bait and switch, letting Mixon go, bringing in Zach Moss, who I think performed very well in substitute of Jonathan Taylor last year. For the most part, I think they're standing pretty pat, and they're probably going to build through the draft, whether that's offensive linemen, whether that's on the defensive side of the ball. I know there's been a lot of smoke about them somehow pulling a glory deal for Justin Jefferson and pulling off, the LSU reunion. We'll see if anything of that actually happens. But basically, I think they're focused on the draft. And so moving into Cleveland, who's seen a lot of movement, obviously didn't achieve exactly what they wanted to achieve last year with some injuries at the quarterback position. Very, very talented team. Tage, what are your thoughts on Cleveland?
Yeah, I mean, I really like a lot of your points about the Bengals. I think when you look to the Browns specifically, like I think that the Jerry Jeudy trade, which happened over the weekend, is like a move that I'd want to make if I was in their situation. You have limited draft capital. We know how strong the first round of receivers are in this class, and especially early second round. Like the Browns were looking at that and not really looking at much of a incentive for them to trade up and get one of those guys, or they knew that they weren't going to be in those spots because of their draft situation. So they ended up making that Jeudy trade, which I think was pretty decent. And then they've made some pretty good signings along the way. The Jameis Winston one in particular, I think is like something of note, because backup quarterback is like a very undervalued thing for these contending teams. You have a situation where you have Deshaun Watson, who's had pretty shaky play since returning, from his year off and his suspension. And he is entering an offense with decent offensive line, Amari Cooper, David Njoku, Jerry Jeudy, Elijah Moore. Like there are pieces there. Kevin Stefanski is a good play caller. Like, I think that they are seeing, a spot where Deshaun might have to, come out of a game, because of injury or performance. And then Jameis can come in and add that high variance aspect to their offense, like we saw with Joe Flacco last year. And so I like that bet that they ended up making with Jameis. And then I also thought Nyheim Hines, who, had the unfortunate jet ski accident last year, was also like a low value or a low risk, high reward signing as well.
Yeah, I'm really excited to see Jameis, because if you thought seeing Joe Flacco just chuck it down the field over and over again 40 times a game to really talented wide receivers, now they've added Jerry Jeudy to that plethora of options. And obviously Jameis, I've watched him for years now, just throwing deep balls down the field. It's absolutely glorious. It's fun, and I'm excited to see. Obviously, given however Deshaun Watson may play, hopefully we get to see in an optimistic fashion. Hope we get to see some Jameis Winston with all those weapons over there in Cleveland. Moving on to Baltimore, obviously big name signing, Derrick Henry. My take kind of was that they have smash and dash X2. Obviously they have Keaton Mitchell, who's blazing fast running back. They have Derrick Henry, who is a bruiser, certified 3.5, 4 yards every play. They have Pat Ricard, who's a defensive lineman back there, 300 pounds. A lot of business decisions going to be made if there's ISOs being run with Pat Ricard and Derrick Henry. And then you have finally Dash as, the MVP of the league, Lamar Jackson. Ben, what are your thoughts on Baltimore?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I've ever heard of this smash and dash before. In my day, we called it thunder and lightning, I think was the combination, but I might just be a boomer at this point is what it sounds like. But no, I mean, like, obviously, Derrick Henry news is going to make the headlines in some ways. Like, getting the guy that can win in December and January makes a lot of sense. And with the direction that they want to go and the roster that they have, I do think the key is still very much going to be like, how much does Zay Flowers kind of emerge, as like a bona fide, legitimate downfield passing option? Because they have that with, Mark Andrews, Isaiah Likely, Derrick Henry. Like, they are a really dangerous football team, and they do have the defensive pieces in place. So I don't think it was like an overly splashy, free agency. And obviously they lost some key guys along, defensive side of football with like Patrick Queen going to division rival, Pittsburgh. But I think overall, like, I think it's an exciting time to be a Baltimore Ravens fan. And I do think that they are, still kind of the team that I think has the most value, of winning the AFC North when you kind of look at, the divisional winner odds, and those sorts of things that are starting to come out. They are, a decent size favorite right now, plus 115 to plus 165 against the Bengals. But I think that they are still the class of the AFC North. And I think, Derrick Henry, although, doesn't necessarily say that, like the running back, market is back or anything. I do think there is some value in like, understanding who you are and kind of pressing those edges when you do need to do that the most. And I do think come playoff time, like Derrick Henry is going to have some valuable moments for this Baltimore Ravens squad for sure.
Yeah, agreed. And I think moving into how we talk about Pittsburgh, I think the Ravens have drafted pretty well in the last couple of years. Obviously, they have Kyle Hamilton, who was a pretty good draft pick and performed really well last year. I think what kind of endears me to the AFC North this year is going into the offseason, all 4 teams could have gone for they could have been extremely active both in the draft and free agency. And I think that some of that clarity is some of that flexibility is still there. I think all 4 of these teams can do a lot of interesting things in the draft. And obviously Cleveland has kind of cashed in some of their draft capital at this point for Jerry Jeudy, but moving into Pittsburgh, obviously they pick up Russell Wilson. We have Deontay Johnson outgoing. A lot of interesting stuff there. Ben, what are your thoughts on Pittsburgh?
Yeah, I would say the Deontay Johnson trade in some ways. The allocation back for the, cornerback just doesn't make a ton of sense, but it does seem, maybe, in the direction in which they want to take this offense, Deontay Johnson might not be as valuable as if he was like catching balls from like Mitchell Trubisky or Kenny Pickett, I guess, as opposed to Russell Wilson. So maybe if that's the angle, but I didn't overall really love that trade, but I do think, they got some high-end play, obviously, they're going to get some high-end play from Patrick Queen. I do think Russell Wilson for the cost that they incurred is going to be, very much up there from like a value standpoint from the quarterback position. So what can they build around him? I think sitting at pick 20, they're not going to have their chance at like the high-end wide receivers. Maybe they get some offensive tackle help in order to kind of bolster, Russell Wilson and his a high average time to throw type situations that he does seem to play his best football in. So I think that's probably the direction they go from the draft standpoint. But to me, this is still, I would say from a roster standpoint, the clear 4-4 team in the AFC North. And I think, when it's all said and done, aren't really going to be all that more improved than where they were at last year. And I think, the longer that they kind of try and do this, like, not allowing, bottom out type situation is only going to like prolong the inevitable. And I think, the Russell Wilson signing in some ways is still kind of kicking that can down the road, unfortunately.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see. Obviously, Russ was a pretty low risk move in terms of just capital, but it could be a high risk move in terms of chemistry or something like that. We have a question here from Eric Eager, noted reader Eric Eager. Guys, what are your thoughts on the Titans all of a sudden becoming a house? I'll hang up and listen. Any thoughts on that, guys?
Yeah, so Eric and I were actually talking about this on the phone this morning about how we love the tail outcomes of the Titans this year. And this was before they ended up signing Calvin Ridley, which happened during our podcast. Where it's like, I'm very curious to see, like, if you look at something like expected fantasy points, which like, is it kind of like a good barometer of like a player's performance in general, like even on the field, like basically every player on the Titans last year underperformed in this metric. Tony Pollard, was a high expected fantasy points, low actual fantasy points guy. DeAndre Hopkins, Calvin Ridley, Will Levis, even the tight end, right? So it's like all of these guys could have some positive regression this year, and the Titans seem to be banking on that. So I'm actually pretty excited about the offense as a whole.
Awesome. Thank you, noted reader Eric Eager. Obviously, Eric Eager, VP at Sumer Sports. We love all the participation. That concludes kind of our rundown of the divisions. But as always on the class play, we're building the team. We're building the historical draft classes for all of us. This week, we're doing wide receivers. I'll start it off with some of my favorite wide receivers, given there's been a ton of discussion about NIL, Nick Saban, obviously great article from ESPN about how Nick Saban decided one day that he didn't want to coach anymore because of how the players only wanted money. And so I wanted to bring up a very interesting NIL story years later. One of my favorite draft prospects at the wide receiver position was Des Bryant. And here's a quote from an ESPN article of why he was suspended his year before he got drafted. Quote, "A person close to the situation said Bryant will tell the NCAA in seeking an appeal of his ineligibility that he did in fact visit Deion Sanders' home to go for a jog, train, and have lunch." Looking at that in 2024, that Des Bryant was suspended for a whole season for, quote, going to Deion Sanders' home, going for a jog, training, and having lunch is so bizarre. No one would believe it. And now Deion Sanders is the coach of Colorado. It just shows you kind of how much the college game has changed for for better or worse, obviously, but it was just an interesting thing to bring up when I read, oh yeah, I remember Des Bryant got suspended. I wonder what he got suspended for. He got suspended for going on a jog with Deion Sanders, something that would perhaps be applauded at this point in NCAA football. Another one I really loved was Michael Crabtree, dominant year at Texas Tech, one of the most fun teams, one of the best games, I think, in NCAA history versus Texas. Just an absolute monster, and went on to a pretty good NFL career, obviously, as well. Tage, who are your 2 picks for this week?
Yeah, I mean, before I say mine, I vividly remember where I was for the Michael Crabtree touchdown, against Texas. It was one of those experiences I don't think you'll forget about, which is awesome. So I have 2 of them, and they're both a little bit throwbacks for at least me. Tavon Austin, I have to mention him when we talk about wide receivers. I think in elementary, middle school, whenever me and my friends got computer time, because we'd get it for 30 minutes or an hour every day, that Tavon Austin highlight video was on instantly. And we're always watching. I still watch it once a month, I feel like at this point. And so I was so excited about him when he came to the NFL. I still think he was too early. If he came out this year instead of when he did, I think that the NFL would be better suited to handle his skill set. I still think that he could have been a pretty good, dynamic type of threat in the league. And then Justin Blackmon was the other one from Oklahoma State. It ended up not working out for him either, but he was someone I loved in college, and was kind of obsessed with the traits that he had. Ended up getting drafted top 5, and had a career that probably left a little bit of meat on the bone, but was still someone I was really excited on when he was coming out.
Awesome. Love both of those guys as well. Obviously, Tavon Austin was an all-time, on the bus, on the yellow dog school bus going to a football game. Boys are getting hyped up, starting to strap the pads on, throw the Tavon Austin highlight film on. You're ready to compete on Fridays, baby. Ben, what about you?
I don't know. I feel like if you were a defensive player, it would have been more of a nightmare than a dream watching that, I would say, for sure. But no, I would say for my dream wide receiver, it starts and ends with Randy Moss. I think if there's a question, the answer is always Randy Moss. He's not only my favorite wide receiver, but he might be my favorite human being ever as well. So I think, obviously I have to have him on my team. And then sticking with, maybe the guys that left a little bit of meat on the bone, Josh Gordon, maybe isn't as high up there from, maybe it is as high up there. I don't know. But I think, basically with what he could have provided to the NFL game, I didn't really get a fair shake. So I think, I'm all about second chance opportunities, and I would love to have him on my team balling out basically, because we all know he's capable for sure.
For sure. And looking back at our teams, we've all collected an interesting collection of talent. I obviously have Reggie Bush, Al Woods, Barkevious Mingo, Des Bryant, and Michael Crabtree. Tage has Tavon Austin, Justin Blackmon, Christian McCaffrey, T. Anthony Thomas, and Ndamukong Suh. And Ben has Randy Moss, Josh Gordon, Michael Bennett, and Gilbert Brown. So some interesting talent, veterans, young guys. We'll see once we get to the end of draft season whose team ends up being the best. But final word here, boys. Who would win in a fist fight? You are a life-sized Eminem. I'm going with me on that one. Tage, who do you think wins?
Actually, I don't trust myself against this life-size Eminem. I mean, they probably have the weight on me, so I'm going to go with the Eminem here. But it's a close one. I don't think it'd be a knockout. We'd go the full amount of rounds. How about you, Ben?
Yeah, I'm with Tage. Obviously, looking at us, we're skinny computer nerds in a lot of scenarios. So I've never actually been in a fist fight before either. I have taken a punch, but I've never thrown a punch. So I think I could maybe stand in there a little bit. I'm not sure I could make strong enough contact to really knock somebody out. So I'm probably taking the Eminem, but it's minus 115, minus 120. It's probably I would say in a lot of scenarios. So.
Obviously, we're all analytics guys. We're all film guys here. If any of y'all need to do some research on what a potential opponent may look like, a life-size Eminem, we can just come visit me. We'll just walk down to Times Square. There's tons of folks in Eminem costumes that we could watch some film on. But as always, thank you for watching the Class Play on the Sumer Sports Show. Everyone, please feel free to contact us on Twitter and join the conversation. doesn't stop here. We can't wait to see y'all next week, and obviously have a good weekend.